I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 12 of my series on the JFK assassination. In the mid-1970s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopens the investigation into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Most Americans were not feeling comfortable with the official version of events. Everything looked a little too pat. Communist kills president. Mafia-like figure supposedly grieving for Mrs. Kennedy kills communist. Criminal investigation immediately shut down. Everything shrouded in secrecy. Records to be kept secret for 75 years. And the American people are exhorted to move on and get on with their lives. People were feeling very uneasy about it. And there were several books being written challenging the official version, raising questions about it. In fact, the New Orleans District Attorney, Jim Garrison, as we discussed in a previous episode, even brought a criminal prosecution proposing that the assassination was actually a highly sophisticated, highly complex regime change operation involving a highly sophisticated, complex cover-up. And people were also discovering nefarious actions by the CIA practically since its inception in 1947. Assassination plots, secret. A secret assassination partnership with the Mafia. This was the premier criminal organization in the world, specializing in murder and cover-up and racketeering and heroin importation. And here was the CIA partnering with them. And then there was MK-Ultra, the infamous drug experiment program. When Congress got wind of that, the CIA immediately destroyed about 99.9% of the MK-Ultra records to prevent the American people from discovering the extent of it. And so Congress, through the U.S. House, brings into existence this investigation or reinvestigation into the Kennedy assassination. As part of this reinvestigation, they called into existence a pathology panel. Its job was to review the official autopsy results, the records, the photographs, the x-rays, and see if they could put their stamp of approval on the official autopsy findings of the military pathologists. And so when the panel met, they had the three military pathologists, Commanders Humes and Boswell and Colonel Fink there, and they had a long discussion, and they finally decided that they were going to put their stamp of approval on this autopsy report, but with one exception. And here was the exception. As you'll recall from the previous episode, the autopsy photographs showed the back of President Kennedy's head to be intact. In other words, no massive 2-inch wide hole that everybody in Dallas had attested to, that from where it was leaking cerebellum. Instead, the back of the head was essentially intact. And what these military pathologists were saying was, oh no, there wasn't any wound there. There was actually a small bullet-sized wound, they said, at the base of President Kennedy's hairline, and that it had exited here on the right side of his head, causing massive damage all alongside the right side of the head. In fact, the damage was so massive that when Kennedy's body was reintroduced into the morgue at 8 p.m. and then in the Dallas casket and then taken out of the casket, people gasped who were in the gallery, because it was shocking that one bullet could cause such massive damage on the right side of his head. Now, if we go back to Dallas for a moment, the Dallas physicians said essentially this is all nonsense, that in Dallas the President Kennedy's head was fully intact, and that what they were dealing with was this large, like orange-sized, fist-sized, been described different ways, wound in the lower back of his head in the occipital region. Well, the panel of pathologists said, look, we're going to approve your autopsy report, but with one exception. And the exception is this. We're moving this bullet entry wound up 4 inches on President Kennedy's head. The three pathologists said, what do you mean you're moving it? That's where it is. That's where it was. No, that bullet entry wound was actually 4 inches higher. No, it wasn't. It was right there. See that little white spot at his hairline? And that's where it was. No, It was located 4 inches higher in this little red spot in the photographs, near the top of President Kennedy's head. Well, finally, they go back and forth, and finally it dawns on Humes what they're getting at. That what they're getting at is this, that if a bullet is fired from the 6th floor of a building, which was the official story, and it hits President Kennedy in the lower back of his head at the hairline, it's going to continue heading downward, which makes it impossible to cause this massive damage up here on the right side of the head. But by moving the wound up 4 inches and angling President Kennedy's head in a special way, it at least becomes conceivable that the bullet enters the top part of his head and exits the right side and supposedly causes all this damage. Well, it finally dawns on Humes what's going on. And so Humes buckles and says, you know what, you're absolutely right. That bullet entry wound was located 4 inches higher. Now, it's not clear whether Boswell and Fink went along with this, but it doesn't matter, because now you have a major divergence on the official story on what the back of President Kennedy's head looked like. Now, the House Select Committee issues a final report on the assassination. And part of this report is saying, you know, we affirm the autopsy findings, with that exception, the bullet entry wound is now 4 inches higher. And then they said, we want to make it clear that everybody at the autopsy, in their interview reports, their testimony, affirmed the autopsy photographs, stating they all stated that the back of Kennedy's head was fully intact except for that bullet entry wound, and that there was no massive damage in the back of President Kennedy's head. So then they proceeded to order that most of the testimonies, the interview reports and everything had to be kept secret for a period of 50 years. Okay, so things go along for about 15 years, and then the Assassination Records Review Board comes into existence. Well, Oliver Stone's movie comes out in 91. He's positing, once again, that this was a national security state regime change operation, massive complex cover-up. And then there's a blurb at the end of the movie that says, they're still keeping their records secret, the national security establishment, the CIA, the military, the Secret Service, all of them, for a period of 50 more years from the House Select Committee hearings, 75 years from the Warren Commission hearings. Well, this threw people into an outrage. What's the story? Why are they keeping these things secret 30 years after the assassination? And even those that cried conspiracy theory to Oliver Stone said, yeah, release the record so we can show everybody that there's nothing nefarious going on here. So the pressure was on for Congress to enact the JFK Records Act and bring into existence the ARRB. Well, the first thing the ARRB declassifies are the House Select Committee investigative reports, the interview reports, the testimonies, and so forth of people at the autopsy. And guess what? They discovered, after reviewing these interview reports and the testimonies, that House Select Committee report that said that everybody at the autopsy was on the same page and saying that there was no damage to the back of President Kennedy's head was a lie. It was a direct, flat-out, unequivocal lie. In fact, it was the exact opposite. Witness after witness had testified and stated that there was massive damage to the back of President Kennedy's head. This included a guy named Jim Jenkins, who was autopsy assistant. He was getting a technology degree at the medical school there. He had described during this House Select Committee investigation this massive wound that was partly in the occipital region of the skull. He even drew a circle in the back of President Kennedy's head to denote the wound. There was another witness, Jan Gale Rudnicki. She was the lab assistant for Commander Boswell. She had testified to this massive wound in the back of his head. John Ebersol, Navy captain, a doctor, he was the radiologist at the autopsy. He testified to the massive wound in the back of President Kennedy's head. And it goes on, like 8 or 9 or 10 witnesses. And so they had flat out lied. And so here you have another major divergence in what's going on here with respect to the official version of the back of Kennedy's head, the condition of the back of Kennedy's head. Now, there was 2 FBI agents who were at the autopsy, and their job was to take detailed notes. They were Francis O'Neill and Jim Sibbert. And they ultimately issued a report called the O'Neill-Sibbert Report. You can see it online. And they were not called to testify before the Warren Commission. They were not called to testify before the House Select Committee for some reason, but the Assassination Records Review Board called them to testify. And they testified separately. They both were shown the official autopsy photographs, and they looked at them, and like Sandra Spencer said, no, those photographs don't show the massive wound on the back of President Kennedy's head. In fact, one of them, I think it was O'Neill, I could be mistaken, described the photographs as appearing doctored. And that was a term they used, one of them used, doctored. Now, the two Navy pathologists, two of the three, were summoned to, all three were summoned to testify before the ARRB. Now, keep in mind that the ARRB couldn't investigate anything. They were prohibited by their mandate. Somebody had inserted that provision into the law that prohibit them from investigating this lie and any aspects of the lie. All they could do was summon people to clarify the record. So they summoned Humes to clarify the record, and Humes gives the official story that there's no massive wound on the back of President Kennedy's head, small bullet wound. I'm not sure at that point whether he had reverted back to the lower location or was still sticking with the upper location. It doesn't matter. But the wound had caused this massive damage, supposedly on the right side of President Kennedy's head. So they called Boswell, but they keep him separate. And they put a model skull in front of Boswell, like a plastic skull. I'm not sure it was plastic, but it was like a model skull. And they've got a magic marker. And they asked Boswell to mark the damage on President Kennedy's head. And Boswell says, no, I'd really rather not do that. And they said, well, no, we really would appreciate you clarifying the damage here. I'd rather not. No, we really need you to do this. So finally, Boswell gives in. He takes the magic marker, and he starts drawing a line from the top of President Kennedy's head all the way down to the back, circling the back where the occipital region was, where the massive hole was that they had seen in Dallas, and saying all of this was damaged. So now you have more divergence in the condition of the president's head. Now, you'll recall from an earlier episode, perhaps, the mention of Gawler's Funeral Home. Gawler's Funeral Home was the most prominent funeral home in Dallas. It performed the funeral for President Kennedy, as we previously discussed. The funeral took place on Monday, but on the night of the autopsy, they were responsible for embalming the body, getting it ready for the viewing in the casket. And one of the embalmers was a guy named Tom Robinson. Robinson was one of the witnesses that in Bethesda that testified about the massive wound in the back of President Kennedy's head, contrary to what the House Select Committee report had indicated. But he saw more than that. He said that when he walked into the autopsy room, he saw Commander Humes using a mechanical saw on the head of President Kennedy. He wasn't the only one. There was a medical technologist. He was getting his degree there at the medical school named Ed Reed. He wasn't a doctor, but he had helped with dozens of autopsies. And he also testified that he saw Commander Humes using a mechanical saw on the head of President Kennedy. Now, somebody might say, well, Jacob, there's nothing unusual about that. This was a gunshot wound. Pathologists would be expected to perform a craniotomy to remove the brain so they can analyze it. Except for one thing. Everybody, including Commander Humes, acknowledges that from the start of the autopsy at 8:15 p.m. to the end of the autopsy, 11:30, nobody, including Commander Humes, used a mechanical saw on the head of President Kennedy. Now, what does this mean? Well, you'll recall that I told you that we still had to discuss what happened in the hour-and-a-half period from the time the body was sneaked in at 6:35 p.m. and the body was officially reintroduced in the front of the facility by the honor guard at 8 p.m. We're now beginning to explore what happened in that hour-and-a-half period. Because since there was no mechanical saw used from 8:15 p.m. to the end of the autopsy, that necessarily means that Robinson and Reed had to have walked into the autopsy room early during that 1.5 hour period of time from 6:35 p.m. to 8 p.m. during which they saw Commander Humes using a mechanical saw on the head of President Kennedy. Finally, if you go back and see the O'Neill-Sibbert report, the two FBI agents, there is a provision, a section in there, where they state that surgery had been performed on the head of President Kennedy. It is undisputed that there was no surgery performed on the head of President Kennedy from the start of the autopsy, 8:15 p.m., to the end of the autopsy. It is also undisputed that there was no surgery performed on President Kennedy's head at Parkland Hospital in Dallas.